Hey Podcast Babe, welcome to season 9 of the Podcast Babes podcast. My name is Anna Klasse, host of this pod and founder of the Podcast Babes. Every week, I interview and inspire a female podcaster here who has made her podcast work for her and her business. So tune in to learn from her mistakes, create your own profitable podcast. Here's today's episode. Hey Podcast Babes, welcome to a new episode. Today I'm here with Melitta Campbell, a multi-award-winning business and mindset coach who uses her 3 decades of marketing and entrepreneurial experience to help women communicate, market, and sell their true value with ease and confidence. Her goal is to help more women attract their dream clients and feel proud of the impact they are having. She is also the host of the Art of Value Whispering podcast. And she is over 200 episodes in, so she definitely has some experience, and also recently did a rebrand of the podcast. So I know that we'll have a lot to talk about. But first of all, welcome to the show, Melitta.
Yeah, it's great to be here. And we were just chatting before that this is the first time I've been on a podcast just talking about my podcast. So I'm excited and a bit nervous.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. I think it's always a little bit different when you're on the other end of the mic, right? When you're not the one asking the questions, but all of a sudden you have to come up with the answers. But I promise you know all the answers.
I've lost control.
Yes. But to kick us off, can you tell us a little bit more? What is the Art of Value Whispering and the podcast, in general? Can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So I started my own business 16 years ago and I was a communications consultant. And as we know, where you start is never where you end up. So that evolved into, I had a brief moment as a product business, and then I became a business coach for small business owners because when I was working with top leaders, I noticed that they struggled to communicate their value. And through my networking with other business owners, I saw just too many of them really struggling to put across the real value of what they offered and in a way that felt natural, that felt smooth, that attracted their right clients. And because they couldn't communicate their brilliance and everything that they had to offer, they were losing out to the often inferior competition. So I saw that I could use my skills to help them to understand what does it take to communicate clearly and effectively and with impact, but in a way that feels really natural to your personality. I'm an introvert, so the way I have developed marketing, communication, sales is a little bit different to a lot of the other coaches that I have worked with or have seen online. And I take a bit of a different approach. And so what I do is I get people to take a big step back and really look at what is the value that they have to offer. And often we miss it because it's something that we do so easily. We think, well, that's not valuable. But other people's like, yes, it is, because I really struggle with that. Or it's something that we just haven't really recognized that this is the thing that we can do that drives value for others. And we're not really used to, particularly women, talking about how great we are and that we can help. And I think for a lot of women, we're starting from below zero because we've been told, no, don't brag, no, don't make a fuss, stay quiet. So we have to get up to zero and then start communicating. So learning how to do that in a way that feels really natural um, is having a really big impact. And I think the value whispering idea is that you take that value and then you weave it through everything that you do, so that when you have that sales conversation, you don't have to sell yourself. You've already done that because people come on the call knowing the value that you offer. They have already been served by you through your content, through your podcast or your blog or your email or your talks or whatever way that you choose to market yourself. And so you just have a very different conversation. So the Art of Value Whispering podcast, as it is now, is really sharing that methodology and sharing a different perspective on marketing, because that's all I've done for the last 30 years is market big businesses, small businesses, everything in between, profit, non-profit. And I've seen clear patterns in what works. And it's different to what I hear a lot of people talking about. There is no one way to market your business. It really depends on you, your personality, the value, how you want to create an impact, and who your clients are and what you enjoy. And so I really, if anyone says, oh, this is the one way you should market your business, you should run in the opposite direction because that's nonsense.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get that message across, and the podcast is the perfect opportunity. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I love what you said about value whispering. I mean, it's in the name, but it's a very value first approach, right? It is how can you already serve people? How can you already basically let them like have a little taste test and try out the value before you get on a sales call? That sounds really authentic to me as well, right? It's just a very genuine way to interact with potential clients. So I really love that.
Yeah. And it really starts with knowing what that value is so that you can really stay focused on just delivering that. You don't feel pulled in all these directions to do everything that everyone else is doing. So it helps keep like comparisonitis and imposter syndrome at bay, and self doubt to an extent. What in my programs we work on mindset a lot, because you also have to believe in that value that you're offering, because then that's when you can really step into that authenticity. And up until that point, until you really believe in it and you understand the impact that you can have for others, it still feels a little bit awkward and clunky and fake to start telling people, like, sharing your expertise. But once you have that belief behind it all as well, then it starts to really just come across really smoothly, and things start to become easier. It's never easy to get out and be visible and share your value, but it certainly starts to feel more comfortable, and you build your confidence step by step as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, knowing your value is super important, right? What is your messaging? But then also, what channel do you use to be visible, of course? And in your case, a few years ago, you decided that's going to be a podcast. How did you make that decision that, okay, to get this message across as an introvert, I think a podcast is a good way to do that. Can you share a little bit more about like why a podcast versus, blogging or, any of the other, million different ways to market and to get that value across to people?
Yeah. So I did have a blog for a long time, and I still have a blog, but my blog is now my podcast, the show notes, and occasionally I put in another article, but the podcast is where I focus. And I started with a Facebook group, and in that group I had like 1,500 women all starting to build a business. And what I heard time after time after time is like, well, everyone else finds this easy, but I struggle because whatever. And everyone felt the same thing. Everyone else is finding this a breeze,
Yeah.
but I'm really struggling. And I also heard from people that has been in business for a month, 6 months, a year. They weren't like a multimillionaire and hugely in profit, and they're like, "Oh, I'm a failure." So I realized people have no real idea what to expect when they start a business. What does it take for women to succeed? How long does that take? What are the processes? What are the do's and don'ts? In that Facebook group, I started interviewing female entrepreneurs about their business, what it's taken for them to succeed, what their lessons were, what they wanted to share. And I loved those interviews, and people really responded well to those. But I took a break to be with my kids. And then come September, when they went back to school, I was really struggling to get back into the interview series. And I was like, why am I struggling? Because I loved them. Had so much energy. I really enjoyed it. But then on reflection, I realized that one of the reasons was that they were sharing such amazing value. I felt like I was hiding it from all the hundreds of thousands of other female entrepreneurs out there who could be benefiting. So I thought, how do I go beyond the Facebook group? And the podcast seemed the perfect opportunity. And I filmed them so I can put them on YouTube and use them in other ways as well. Although I wasn't brave enough to put any of the videos out for about 6 months, but I just started with the audio. But yeah, so I started to put the podcast out there, and I did 189 episodes where it was me interviewing other women. And occasionally I would share my own expertise if something particular came up or I was feeling inspired. But the episodes where it was just me had by far the most listeners and the most response from people. And people would message me and say, "Oh, thank you so much for saying that. I feel so much better about whatever the topic was." So the interviews were brilliant, and they shared so much value. But I was starting to see, after that many interviews, I was starting to see patterns between what they were sharing, and it was getting harder and harder to have interviews that said something really different, that was completely new and exciting. And I was getting stuck in a pattern. And so it wasn't so exciting anymore. And I kind of felt we've covered what it means to be successful as a female entrepreneur with having these same lessons come up. And it was nice to showcase different businesses. And I live in the Swiss Alps, so I don't get to network with as many other business owners as I'd like. So it was brilliant networking for me. I made many friends from the people that came on the show, but it was time to do something different. So at the same time, I had taken my approach to marketing and rebranded it as value whispering, because effectively that's what it is. And I wanted it to be visibly different. As soon as people heard about it, they're like, "Oh," they would lean in and say, "What is that then?" So it gives me a chance to explain why my approach is a little bit different. Although, hand on heart, I think it's just good old fashioned marketing. And I think what other people are calling marketing these days isn't necessarily what we were, well, certainly not what I was taught in my degree and master's and everything 20 odd years ago. But it really gets the point across that you don't have to be loud. You don't have to be everywhere. You don't have to burn out to market your business. There is another way. And so that was the message that was really starting to resonate with people last year. And so I thought, okay, I need to go all in on the art of value whispering. So in January, or when I relaunched in sort of end of January as a podcast, I rebranded it the art of value whispering, so I could really start to focus more on meaningful marketing and self-leadership. That was really the focus, because that's the focus of my work. And I can have more scope to talk about my approach to marketing, sales, communications, leadership, mindset, all of that kind of thing. So I had plenty to talk about. And I made a commitment to do one interview on one solo episode. And I've been able to keep that up so far. I've been very brave.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's amazing. So what I'm hearing you say is that there were actually many steps involved from launching the podcast, even before launching the podcast, right? You did already interviews in your Facebook group before you created a podcast and made it visible and also accessible to more people who are also not in the Facebook group. And then there was a new iteration, from mostly interviews, doing some solo episodes, noticing that, oh, those solo episodes are actually performing great. Like, people love this. And so I want to do more of it. And then also niching down, or I don't want to say niching down, maybe it's more renaming your approach, or, defining your approach further into value whispering, and then a rebrand for the podcast that also came with that. So it's not that you started a podcast, you immediately knew exactly what it was going to look like and that it stayed the same over 200 plus episodes, but you noticed what was working and what wasn't working. Maybe having it in the Facebook group so that it's not accessible for everyone was maybe not necessarily working, in the sense that you wanted to share it with more people. And then you took actions and made tweaks along the way. Can you share about some other things that worked maybe either really well for the podcast? Let's maybe start there, because, sticking to it for over 200 episodes is huge. And consistency is so difficult for everyone, right? For every single podcaster, I'm sure. How did you do it?
Yeah, it hasn't always been pretty. Sometimes I went through a phase of probably about a year. I worked with an external editor, and so I got really organized, and I batched my podcasts and I got them all out, and he would do the sound editing. He didn't edit the content. It pushed me to get really organized, and then I discovered the script, and I could do a lot of that for myself, and I could clean things up the way I wanted to, and I could started to get a bit more creative. So I could put a teaser at the beginning, which is something I always wanted to do, but I didn't it was difficult. But with Descript, it's just so easy.
Mhm.
So it was just like, okay, I just copy paste. Wow. It was so that, finding that tool really helped me massively as well. So I could really start to clean up the episodes, shorten them, have a more exciting bits of content. So I'm still experimenting a little bit with that. But yeah, that was a change. But because I could manage it myself, then I did get a bit more spontaneous. So sometimes the episode is finished like literally 5 minutes before it's published, which I wouldn't recommend doing. I would recommend having a bit more of a schedule, which I'm back to now. Because what happened was, and maybe this is a learning as well, I was all organized and I had 6 podcast guests in a row who didn't show up for their podcast episodes because they were based in the States and they they misunderstood the timings because in Europe we have the 24-hour clock. So at 0200 is 2 o'clock in the morning, but they were assuming, oh, that's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They
Yeah.
didn't because here we can't use AM and PM because in French, I live in a French speaking country. Après-midi is AM, which is afternoon, not
Yeah.
morning. So
Yeah.
you can't use it, doesn't work. You have to use a 24-hour clock. So, and I put an explanation on, like, just so it's in the 24-hour clock, which in the States is called army time or military time, I think. So and I really expelled it out, but the people were still getting booking in the wrong, which put me so far behind. And that's when it all started to become a bit more spontaneous. So I think you understand some of these things, and I put together like a Google form so I could capture things because people were sending things bit by email and it was getting lost, and so I needed a simple system that was really idiot proof for me to do. So people book on Calendly, and that automatically sets up the podcast link for the interview, and it can get their questions, and it's all really simple now. It all works on autopilot almost. But yeah, it took a little bit of trial and error to get there. And yeah, the podcast has evolved as I've got a bit older and a bit more comfortable interviewing people. It's something I've done throughout my career, but not live on camera.
Mhm.
Usually I was like doing PR training with leaders and things like that. So I'm teaching them how to, like, I'm doing interviews for them, but just for print content or to train them to be on camera. And I wasn't on camera; they were. They were. So that all was a learning curve as well. So it took a bit of time to get comfortable with that. But starting with interviews is a great way to do that because it does take the pressure off a lot, and then you start to learn a bit more about people's personalities and how you can bring that out and what kind of questions get what kind of response. So yeah, it's been a real fun journey, and I've just loved all the relationships that I've made along the way. But also a big thing for me because I am quite introverted. I wrote a book, The Shy Girl's Guide to Networking, because I used to be so shy. I couldn't do anything, and
Mhm.
so doing this every single week pushes me to stay visible because if I stop, I will just happily hide behind my computer. And that's that. So it's part of my self personal development as well. So yeah, it's done so much for me and I really enjoy it. So it's become the core part of my marketing content. I do wonder myself sometimes, how have you kept this going for 4 years?
Yeah.
It doesn't quite feel like it's been that long, um, but I think just because I really love it. And
Yeah.
it takes a lot of time. I hadn't quite appreciated just how much time. I don't know how long your episodes take, but mine start to finish, finding a guest, approaching them, getting all the content, the interview, editing, promoting, start to finish, everything included, probably takes myself and my team about 5 hours. And so, yeah, it's not something that I think I could have taken on in my business any earlier because I just
Mhm.
didn't have that time. But now I've got my system, I've got a VA supporting me. I can just do all the fun bits now, which is great.
Yeah, that is great. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting what you said also about seeing this as such a great networking tool as well. So it's not only about the content and the content reaching your, potential clients who then will find you and your business, but it's also about the conversations that you're having on the show and networking with guests as well, which I think is also something that, is often overlooked. I don't hear that many people say, oh, I want to start a podcast because I really want to use it as a networking tool, but it's such a great bonus, for
Mhm.
sure. And just, having the opportunity to ask so many questions to an expert in their field is pretty special, I think.
Yeah, it's a bit like my private mastermind as well, because
Yeah.
you don't just have the interview, you have a bit of time to chat beforehand. And then afterwards, with some guests, I've chatted for like 2 hours afterwards, and I've been able to pick their brains like, so how exactly did you do this? And have you ever struggled
Yeah.
with this before? So
Yeah.
it's been really great, not just to build relationships, but to learn from, as you say, learn from experts. But yeah, off camera, we get even more insights, which is sometimes I think I should film those bits as well, and then take some of the kind of gems that come out of that and put it in. Another mistake that I still make is I talk to people too long before starting the interview, because very often they'll say amazing things
Yeah.
and then they won't say it again on camera because they've kind of ticked it off their list of
Yeah.
things to say. So yeah, I'm still working on that one.
There's always room for improvement, right? And I think if that's the only thing, then you're doing great. So you mentioned that the podcast is now a very core part of your marketing. And, as a marketing professional, I think that says a lot. That must mean that it works really well for marketing your business. Can you share a little bit more about how that works exactly? Like how, or at least how much you want to share about this? What do you mean when you say it's the core part of your business marketing?
Yeah, it gives me a lot of flexibility because I can say more on a podcast and it's me. I if I'm writing a newsletter or writing an article, I can edit it, and obviously I edit out all the nonsense I say on podcasts, because sometimes I go down some rabbit warren and it's just not interesting. So I just cut that bit out. But it's genuinely me and my opinions on the podcast. And when people hear you, then I think they connect with that more if they're the right people. And
Mhm.
if they're the kind of people that I hate listening to Melita, the way she explains it, her voice, oh my God, I hate it. We're never going to work together.
Yeah.
So it's quite a nice qualifying tool, but it gives me an opportunity to really go behind the scenes in a lot of what I talk about in my more edited, polished content elsewhere. And and there's no limit. You can talk for 5 minutes if that's all it takes to put your point across about something important, or half an hour. So you can really take the time you need to explain something well and clearly for the audience. And you can get flexible. So I've had, for my milestone episodes, I've had like a panel interview with previous guests where that was really fun because I could ask someone, oh, you said this in your interview, but I'm really curious what so and so, how you would answer that question, or how you would do it. So I could like bring them in, and in fact, the guests loved it so much. They stayed networking and chatting for another hour after we finished
Wow.
recording.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to do more of those. I've only done I've done about 3 or 4, but they're really fun. It takes a bit more organization, that's the only thing.
Mhm.
And I've had, before the podcast was called the Driven Female Entrepreneur Podcast. And so every November I would bring in men for November. Otherwise it was always women. So it was quite interesting to see the contrast,
Mm.
because it was different. Interviewing men is different to interviewing women. That was just really just interesting for me. You can get creative. I feel that I could do a lot more as well. So I'm looking at what can I do next, and how can I explore and do things differently. And I want to do some best of videos,
Mm.
episodes, but yeah, they just take a bit of thought and planning. I
Yeah.
have ADHD, so it's not always my strong point. But yeah, it's fun, it's interesting, and you can repurpose it so many different ways, because you have the audio, you have the video, you have, yeah, you can just really, I've created blog posts, and I've created summaries and wrap up posts and all sorts of things from the content on the podcast. And by being more strategic now, talking about the value whispering, when I'm having a conversation with someone and they have a question around their marketing or communications or their sales, I can send them an episode of the podcast. Say, hey, listen to this.
Yeah.
This will tell you a bit more about it. And I can explain it in a different way to how I would just responding in a LinkedIn message or an email or something. So you can use it as part of your sales process, because when we have people that are interested in our business or start to come into our world, only about 3 or 5% are ready to buy. So you need to build that relationship over time. You need to nurture them, and sending them a podcast every week, and a podcast that or recommendations based on their questions
Mhm.
feels very personal and value driven as well. So yeah, so I love it for all of those reasons.
Yeah, it's interesting what you just said. That also, now that the content type is a little bit different, it also turns more into a resource bank, right?
Yeah.
Where if people have specific questions, the answer is in a podcast episode, and they can listen to you, to your voice, explain it to them, which is so powerful. So yeah, that's also really cool to hear. Anita, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your podcast journey with us today. Final question: what would be your top advice for someone starting a podcast today in 2024?
Yeah. I think the main thing is make sure you have the time to do it well and consistently, because
Mhm.
otherwise you'll probably know the percentages, but it's a crazy high percentage of people that have never got beyond episode 3 of their podcast, because they suddenly realize, oh gosh, it's a lot of effort. But one nice way to test it, which I hadn't heard of before, but you can do seasonal podcasts. You don't have to do something that's forever. And so you can test it and just do a season of 6 episodes and put those out there, like create them nicely, and then see how that felt for you, see what the response was and how you want to use it. And you can get again creative with the seasons, so you can have a season for a theme of something that you're promoting, or something, there's a series of questions or objections that people have for your product. You can answer those in a season. So you can start to use the podcast as a tool. So I think that's what I'm recommending to my clients anyway. If they're thinking of starting a podcast, they're not quite sure if it's for them, how it's going to work out. I said, test it with a season.
Mhm.
And then that's always that. Then if you only do the 6 episodes, at least you have a complete set, rather than it looking like you've just done 2 and gave up.
Mhm.
So I think that's a nice way to go. And the final tip would be have a process. That has
Yes.
really saved me so much. Have a simple process. I just use um, Zoom, Calendly, Google Forms, and Descript. Those
Mhm.
are my main tools, and with that, everything is pretty straightforward and easy.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. A process is super important. And I think that also allows you to have more fun in recording the interviews or recording the solo episodes, because you won't have to worry about, oh my God, now I have to do all the other things. And what do I actually have to do? Like, you don't have to reinvent the wheel for every single episode, but you know exactly, okay, I recorded, this is where it goes, this is the next step, this is how we promote it, done. And then on to the next one.
Yeah.
And that also helps with having more fun, like I said, but also with the consistency. I think it's just way easier to stay consistent if you have that process really dialed in. I think that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense, and absolutely great advice. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Melita. Where can people find your podcast? Can you tell us again, maybe the website, the podcast, and then we'll also link everything in the show notes.
So it's the Art of Value Whispering podcast. And you can find it on my website. If you go to melittacampbell.com, that's Melitta with 2 T's. And then there's the podcast, or just slash podcast. You'll find all of the episodes there. And there you can click search. So if there's a topic you're interested in, you can hit search and find that. It's also on everywhere.
Yeah.
iTunes, Spotify, Audible, YouTube. If you prefer to watch the videos, they're on YouTube, and we've got shorts, like little snippets from the show on there. And if you have any questions at all, you can find me on LinkedIn or at school with a K.com. I have the free community, the Dream Clients Club, which is where we go behind the scenes of the podcast and continue that conversation as well. And there's a whole heap of free tools and resources in there as well.
Amazing. Perfect. Well, make sure to link that. And also, yeah, I saw on your website, you also have the buttons or the links to all the different podcast apps on the website as well. So maybe that's a good start off point. And then people can find everything there. Thank you again for being here today and sharing your podcasting wisdom with us. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome. Thanks, Anne. And I say it's really interesting to talk about the podcast and the other side. So fun. Okay. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
I'm glad to hear that. All right, that's it for today's episode. Need some help to get your podcast off the ground? Not sure where to start and what to focus on? Go to thepodcastbabes.com to schedule a call and learn more about our podcast launch and production services. See you next week.